If you caught my PlayStation review, you already know my thoughts on Warriors Abyss. If not, this Switch review will still cover the story, gameplay and structure for those jumping in fresh. And that said, if you've watched the PlayStation review, you might want to skip straight to performance. There's nothing new here. Now with that out of the way, I had some optimism going into the Switch version. Warriors games aren't strangers to the platform, and while visual downgrades were expected, I hoped the core gameplay loop would still hold up. That optimism didn't last long. If you enjoyed today's review, do me a favour, subscribe, it helps out the channel a huge amount. The Warriors series for me has never been about deep storytelling. These games are about momentum, about carving through enemies in an unrelenting spectacle, with narrative often serving as little more than a backdrop. Warriors Abyss, however, attempts something different, at least at first. You're a warrior summoned to hell, fighting to reclaim a lost kingdom alongside a fallen king. It sets itself up like a game that wants story to matter, throwing heavy exposition, long cutscenes, and relentless dialogue at you in the opening hour. But then, weirdly, the game forgets about it. Where a genre masterpiece like Hades threads narrative into its structure, rewarding repeated runs with evolving character interactions, Abyss does the opposite. It front-loads everything, then immediately lets it fade into the background. There's no character development, no changing world, no reason to stay invested. What begins as an attempt to build a more engaging premise ends up feeling like wasted effort, neither enhancing the roguelike design nor standing on its own. Had Abyss either fully committed to its story or stripped it back entirely, it might have worked. Instead, it now feels like an afterthought, a layer of clutter rather than a meaningful part of the experience. At first glance, Warriors Abyss follows the familiar Warriors formula, light and heavy attacks strung into flowing combos, sending waves of enemies flying in every direction, incredibly satisfying. But while it may look like a traditional Warriors game, it plays very differently. As a roguelike, it forces a more tactical approach where survival hinges on precision rather than sheer aggression. Button mashing here will only get you so far before you're overwhelmed, and every encounter carries more weight than in a typical Warriors power fantasy. The summoning hero system is the heart of the combat then, allowing you to call in allies mid-combo for powerful attacks before they vanish behind cooldowns. This mechanic rewards careful planning, as your allies' activation points, they're dictated by the formation system. Now it's a layered setup that determines both passive buffs and when warriors trigger during a combo string. Some formations require multiple light attacks before a summon is unleashed, while others are tied to heavy strikes. Now if this all sounds like too much to manage, the game offers an auto formation option, but mastering these systems, it leads to some of its most satisfying moments. With over 100 warriors to recruit and play as then, the sheer variety in playstyles should, in theory, encourage experimentation. Some characters excel in speed, others in brute force, and a few specialize in ranged attacks. However, balance issues quickly undermine this depth. Some warriors are significantly stronger than others, and once you stumble upon an overpowered character, the challenge here rapidly diminishes. The unique strategy systems it's set up in the foreground, which should provide opportunities for creative team building, instead now feel underwhelming when the game's difficulty is really dictated more by which warriors you acquire rather than by skill or strategic planning. Perhaps the biggest misstep in combat though, it's the dash mechanic. Dodging is a fundamental part of any action-heavy roguelike experience, especially in one when you're constantly surrounded, yet Abyss for some reason locks it behind a cooldown. This limitation makes evasion feel frustrating, disrupting the natural rhythm of combat. Instead of offering a smooth reactive system that allows for quick getaways or last-second maneuvers, the game's kind of forcing you into a rigid artificial constraint that often leads to cheap hits rather than genuine challenge. It's more about keeping a distance a lot of the time. And this restriction is particularly frustrating given how much of the game demands precise movement. Late game encounters throw increasingly aggressive enemies at you, and without a reliable dodge, defensive play feels clunky rather than skillful. It creates a strange dissonance. The game encourages careful, calculated combat through its summoning and formation systems, yet undercuts that depth by limiting one of the most essential mechanics in an experience like this. This said, combat's not without its highlights too, I do want to be fair here. Special attacks which charge up through battle provide rewarding bursts of power, allowing you to turn the tide against tougher foes. And then there's the team attack, a full screen spectacle where the world shifts to black and white and your character becomes an unstoppable force of destruction. These moments embrace the over-the-top spectacle Warriors games are known for, delivering the kind of raw power trip that makes the genre appealing in the first place. But the issue here is consistency. For every thrilling moment of perfectly executed destruction, there's an equally frustrating instance where the game's restrictive mechanics work against you, making combat feel needlessly frustrating when it should just be absolutely exciting. Beyond combat then, Warriors Abyss is structured as a 4-layer descent into hell, with each layer consisting of 8 levels leading up to a boss fight. Objectives start out simple: defeat 30 enemies. You do that in like a split second, but they quickly escalate to absurd proportions. By the late game, you'll be tasked with eliminating 800 enemies in a single stage, turning what would typically be a thrilling power trip into a grueling endurance test. And then of course, being a roguelike, the game's call it really revolves around risk and reward. Each level presents choices: recruit a new warrior, unlock upgrades, spend currency at special locations, healing stations appear every so often, treasure chests with rewards, they're here every so often too, and then there's danger zones. These throw even more enemies at you in exchange for better rewards. Now, it took me 6 hours on the PlayStation to complete my first run, not based on any skill unfortunately, it was because, as I mentioned, the overpowered characters. And that's where it becomes disappointing once you do realize that. It's very easy to kind of navigate each of these different locations to build that kind of ultimate buffed warrior. Enemy variety then is another issue here. Initially, the sheer number of enemies flooding the battlefield is impressive. It's a classic warrior spectacle of bodies flying in every direction. But as the game progresses, it becomes clear that most enemies exist purely to be cut down en masse. Not too different to a typical Warriors game, honestly, but I think it's how it does the threats in this game that feels so weak. So basically, the real threats are telegraphed with large purple indicators, turning later encounters into a predictable game of dodging obvious attacks rather than engaging in dynamic combat with the entire field. More variety here in enemy behavior and attack patterns could have gone a long way in keeping this one replayable. So for gameplay, I'm going to say this: there's a strong foundation here, one that combines warrior style action with roguelike tension in a way that at times genuinely works. But for every moment of thrilling combat, there's another where the game feels like it's just fighting against itself. The restrictive dodge, the inconsistent difficulty, and the reliance on luck over strategy all hold it back from reaching its full potential. So performance is where everything falls apart for the Switch build. At first I thought this version might be worthwhile, the expected visual downgrades were there, but early encounters seemed stable enough. I figured the core experience might survive intact. That optimism, again, didn't last long. As soon as the game started ramping up enemy count, the frame rate took a nosedive. The first major drops appeared when I faced mid-game encounters, where the screen filled with dozens of enemies at once, but it was the endgame that truly broke the experience. By the time I reached the later layers of hell, where objectives demanded that you cut through 600, 800 enemies in a single stage, the game collapsed under its own weight. Frame rates plunged below 20 FPS, turning what should be fast, responsive combat into a near unplayable slog. Inputs became sluggish, dodging felt delayed, and every attack lacked precision. I lost countless battles with the Switch build, not because of mistakes I made, but because the game simply couldn't keep up with itself. By the end, I wasn't fighting the enemies, I was fighting the performance. And look, if I hadn't already played through the PlayStation version, I genuinely don't think I could have finished it. Just quickly then, just for the full picture, I do want to touch on graphics, and Abyss was not visually impressive on PlayStation. The Switch version isn't much different. Textures are muddy, environments are bland, and enemy designs lack detail. The downgrade, however, from PS5 to Switch is minimal. That's not, however, a compliment. The game already looked dated, and reducing the resolution, it doesn't help. The same handful of environments repeat endlessly, and yeah, you basically, within a couple of runs, you've seen it all, basically. And yeah, there's nothing about this world that stands out. There's something that stands out about the characters either. It all feels very copy and paste. The enemies, I swear, are the same from beginning to end outside of the 4 different bosses that you will face. It makes each run just feel very repetitive, and yeah, that's disappointing in a game that's really supposed to have been built to keep you coming back. So overall, look, I had issues with Warriors Abyss on PlayStation, but at least it was functional. The gameplay had flaws, the story was forgettable, and the balance was questionable, but it ran well enough to let its best ideas shine, at least some of the time. Here, it's not just flawed, it's fundamentally broken. Even if you somehow overlook the uninspired visuals, the lack of enemy variety, or the flawed roguelike balancing, none of it matters when the game simply doesn't run well enough to be playable. Combat, the very core of the experience, is completely undermined by abysmal performance. Inputs are delayed, the dodging is unreliable, and late game encounters feel less like battles and more like trying to wade through quicksand. If Warriors Abyss already felt unpolished on PlayStation, the Switch version is outright unfinished. This isn't just a bad port, it's a game that struggles to function at even the most basic level. Every attempt at engaging with the combat, experimenting with the roguelike systems, or even reacting in real time is made needlessly frustrating by the technical shortcomings. The game is actively fighting against you, not because of its difficulty, but because of its complete inability to maintain a stable frame rate when it matters most. So yeah, look, this isn't just a case of a few rough patches or occasional frame rate dips. This is a game that collapses under its own weight the moment it asks anything of the hardware. The more enemies it throws at you, the worse it gets, until what should be a test of skill and endurance turns into a fight against the game itself. I cannot recommend it, not even at a discount, not even out of curiosity. The Switch version isn't just a downgrade, it's a broken experience. Today it's a bad 3 out of 10, do not play this version. And that is my less than favourable thoughts on Warriors Abyss on Nintendo Switch. I wish it was a happier video, shall we say, but look, the game isn't particularly brilliant on PlayStation, so I don't think we're missing out on all that much. It's just disappointing to see it crumble under performance issues. But yeah, let me know if you've been playing it, what you think in the comments down below. If you are thinking about it again, do look to another system in this case. And yeah, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, it helps out the channel a huge amount. Cheers all.